Hello everyone, this is the second video in a mini series I started on how to create a pagination system using PHP and MySQL database. In the previous video, we were able to complete the design with HTML and CSS only, so the content you see on this page is only static content, which means it's not yet coming from a database. Our task in this video is first to create a MySQL database and insert some articles into it. Then we will connect our application to that database and fetch those articles and display them on the page while implementing the pagination feature. So to begin with the first step of creating the database, I'm going to open PHP MyAdmin where I create our database. As you can see, we already have a database called Pagination PHP, so we are going to choose a different name for the new database to avoid a conflict. So I'm just going to call the new database Pagination Tutorial, and this database is going to have only one table, the posts table, and it will have 3 columns. The first column is the ID column of type int, and it should have at most 11 digits for the longest ID value, and it should also be auto incrementable. The next is the title of the article, which should be of type varchar, and it should be at most 100 characters long. Lastly, we'll have the created field. It should be of type datetime, and it should have a default value of the current timestamp. So we click save, and it will create our table. The next thing we want to do is insert some articles into this database. So I'll click on the insert tab here, and you see some input fields for us to create new articles. We will only specify the titles because the ID and the created columns will be automatically generated. If you want to create more rows, you just need to add or increment this value, and new input fields will be shown. When you are done with the articles you want to create, you just click on go, and it will insert the rows that you specified. If you click on browse now, you are going to see that we have 3 articles now in our post table. If we open the previous database that I used when I was creating the course material for this course, you are going to see that it already has so many articles that will be very good for us to use in our pagination system. So rather than inserting articles again in the new database, I'm just going to delete the new database we just created so that we can rely on the old database for our pagination system. The only reason I created the new database in the first place was just to involve you in every step of the process. So that database, the table in that database is basically the same structure as this one, so we are going to use this one instead. So that's it with our database. We are now ready to connect to our database, fetch those articles, and start implementing our pagination feature. So this is where we ended in the previous video. Like I said, we only did the design in that video. So in our project folder, we have only these 2 files. We are going to add another file called config.php, and the first thing we'll do in this file is to connect to our MySQL database. We are going to use PDO in this tutorial, so I'm going to create a new PDO connection object. So this PDO instance, or the PDO constructor, receives 3 major arguments. The first is the database connection string, and the next 2 are the username and the password required to access the database. We are going to define the values for these 2 very soon. For now, let's specify the value for the connection string. So the connection string is basically a string, a formatted string that describes the database we are connecting to. The first part of the string is the type of the database. In this case, it's a MySQL database, so the type is going to be MySQL, followed by a colon, and then we specify the host, which in this case is localhost, since the database is running on our local computer. And lastly, we have the database name, which, if you remember correctly, is Pagination PHP. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in the string. Now that's all about the database connection string. Let's define the values for the username and the password we use to access the database. Like I said, the database is running on the local host, so the values I have for the username and password might be different from your own values. So for these two variables, the user and the password, the username and the password, make sure you enter the values you require to access your local database. Okay, just to make this more presentable, I'm going to pull these variables out into their own variables, or I'm going to pull the values out of the connection string into their own variables. So the first one is the host, and the next one is the database name. So I'm going to cut this, and that will basically just be the same thing. The last thing we need to do to this connection object before we start using it to query our database is to provide some default configuration options. The first configuration option is to set the default fetch mode to associative array, which basically means that when we use this object to query our database for records, it should return the records as in the format of an associative array, which is a lot easier to work with in our PHP application. So in order to set this, we are going to call a method on the connection object called setAttribute, and it's going to take some two parameters which are all PDO constants. The first one is the fetch mode, and the second one is fetch assoc. So when we fetch records from our database, they will be returned as associative arrays thanks to this configuration option. The second one, you might not be very familiar with it, but I'm going to explain it better when we arrive at the point in our code where we are making use of it. But for now, just know we are going to pass two parameters. The first one is the emulate prepares constant, and the second is going to be the value false. So this is it about the configurations. We can now use this connection object to query our database for records. We are going to need a file to store all the logic for our application. So we are going to create a file called postController to hold that logic. Since we are going to be fetching records from the database in this file, we are going to include the config.php file I just created. So when we include it in this way, we are going to have access to our connection object, and we can use it to query our database. We will be needing this postController.php file inside the index.php too. So let me just include it at once. Okay, so we have included it inside our index.php. Let's come back to our postController file and start writing our first SQL query to run on our database. The process of querying our database can be broken down into three simple steps. The first step, where we write the query. The second step, in which we prepare the query. And the third step, we are going to execute the query. So let's take these steps one at a time. We're going to write an SQL query in the first step to select all from the posts table And in the second step, we're going to prepare this query. And in order to prepare, we'll make use of the connection, the database connection object we defined inside config.php. We are including that file inside this file, so we will be able to have access to the connection object. And this connection object has a method on it called prepare, and this method takes the SQL query it wants to prepare. And when this method runs, it's going to return a statement, which is basically an object that also has a few methods on it. One of those methods is the execute method, which does exactly what it says. It executes the query against the database. So after doing that, the next step will just be to get the data from the execution, the result of the execution. So what we're fetching was posts, and we can get the post data from the statement by executing the fetch all function on the statement. So when we do that, we can just print that statement, or rather we can just print the array of posts as a raw string. Okay, now we are including our post controller inside the home page or the index.php page. So if we reload the index.php page, we should expect this string, or rather this array, to be printed on the screen. So if you reload, you're going to see it's returning all the articles from the database. But this string is very difficult for us to read, much less understand the structure. So I have a little trick I'm going to play on this printr function to make it display these posts in a way that is easier for us to read and understand. So I have a function that I always use in almost every vanilla PHP project I work with. It's basically a function that helps me to display data in a way that it's easier to read. So I basically modify the printr function. On any data I want to print, I will pass it to this dd function, and then it will display that data while wrapping it around some formatting tags. So instead of printing with the printr function, I'm going to invoke this function I defined here and pass the posts to it, and then it's going to be displayed in a nicely formatted way. Let's reload the page and see how this looks. Alright, so this clearly looks so much cleaner than before. As you can see, we have an array of arrays in which each of the arrays within represents a record from the database. Also, when we were writing our SQL query, we did not specify the order in which we want these posts to be returned. But in MySQL, by default, records are going to be returned in ascending order of the primary key column, which is why our articles here are appearing in ascending order of the ID column, because the ID column is our primary key. Now we are going to implement the pagination itself at the level of the database, which means we are going to be writing or modifying our SQL query to paginate the results that are coming from the database. We are going to do a quick demonstration now to show you how we are going to achieve this. Suppose we want to be displaying 5 articles per page in our pagination system. It means on page 1, we're going to be displaying these first 5 articles. And in order to do that with SQL, to fetch only the first 5 articles in SQL, we're going to use the limit keyword and specify a number which represents the number of articles we want to limit our select to. So this simply says select from the post articles, but only return the first 5 articles you meet. So let us execute this and see how it works. I'm going to open a new tab so that we can reference what we get against the list of all the articles. And as you can see, we are having articles with ID from ID 1 to ID 5, which is the first 5 articles here, 1 to 5. So this is how we fetch page 1 articles. A more elaborate way to do this is to use what we call an offset, which is the position in which we want to start fetching our 5 articles. Then we separate them by a comma. So I want us to fetch from position 0 and then 5 articles from there, which is basically the same thing. So if we refresh, we still see the same 5 articles starting from the one at position 0. And now when you hear me mention position, because this is what is going to help us to fetch according to pages, and whenever I mention a position here, just know that it's a position with respect to the entire list of arrays, not just the one that is currently being fetched. So this one has taken us from position 0, and then 5 articles from there has landed us at position 4. That is this 0 to this 4. So if we want to fetch the next page, we'll start now from the next item in line, which is from 5, and then 5 articles from there. It will land us at position 9. So if we want to fetch page 2, we'll just specify that it should start fetching from position 5 and then 5 articles from there, and we'll get our page 2 results. So again, I'll open this on a new tab, and let's see, position 5, it has ID 6, and then 5 positions later is position 9, it has ID 10. So 6 to 10, that's the correct results we expect for page 2. So we are now at position 9, and if we want to fetch page 3, we'll begin at the next index in line, which is 10. So we'll specify 10 here, and then once again we'll open on a new tab, and let's see, at position 10 the ID is 11. Position 10 the position again is only works for the entire list. The ID is 11. Then 5 articles from there, we have the ID 15. So page 1, 2 and 3 are working correctly, and this is when the offset is respectively 0 for page 1, page 2 we have 5, and page 3 we have 10. And from this point we can actually make out what the next or the subsequent offsets are going to be. For page 4 it will be 15, page 5 20, 25 and so on. So basically it's a multiple of the number of articles we want to display per page. In this case, multiples of 5. Now obviously we are not going to be hard coding the value in our query. We are going to dynamically pass values to this query using what we call parameters, which function the same way as function parameters. Whenever you want to pass a value to a function, you usually use parameters of that function to pass values to that function. In this case, we are passing values to a query, so this is its own sort of parameters. And the way we define a parameter is you begin by a colon and then you give the name of that parameter. So in this position, we are going to be passing in the offset, and then the next position will pass in number of records. Okay, so we have defined the positions. Now let us define the data that's going to go into those positions. We are going to define an associative array in which the keys of that array represent the positions that we want to inject those values into. So at this position, and make sure that these keys match the positions themselves. So in the offset position, we want to pass, let's just hard code the value 0 again, and then the next position is the offset, and the next position is the number of records, and we want to display 5 articles. Or we have used 5 too often, let me use 3 this time. just so that we can see it work on the interface. Now, having defined the data, we have not yet passed it to our query. So this is just an independent variable on its own. So it's in the execute section, the execute step, that we are going to pass the data, and our execute function will inject the values in the appropriate positions in the query and then execute that. So if we execute this, we expect to see the first 3 articles returned. So let's close all our tabs but one, and then when we refresh, you can see that it's returning the first 3 values. Let's set it back to 5 because it's going to be convenient to calculate the number of pages when we start clicking on the link or on the next page and the previous page links. Alright, so our next step is to display these posts now on the home page. So I'm going to get rid of this print statement, and then I'll open index.php, and you can see that we are already including postcontroller.php inside index.php. So the post array is going to be automatically available inside our index.php. Down here, this is the space where we are supposed to be displaying the articles. I'm going to remove some of these hard-coded articles we were using in our design, and I'll leave just one. And then I'll use a for each loop and loop through the variable posts from the post controller file. And for each post, we are going to display an article, and instead of the hard-coded string, we're going to be pulling the actual database value from the current post variable in the loop, and we're displaying the title. So let us refresh, and as you can see, it's displaying the first 5 articles. Yeah, the first 5 articles. Okay, so I've noticed that this video is getting too long. I usually try to limit the length of the video to about 25 or at least under 30 minutes. But I think if I want to continue to complete this pagination system, it might be longer than 30 minutes. So I think this is a good place for us to stop and then continue in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next episode.